Did you ever hear the tragedy of Firewall Ultra? Well, if you were there to experience it, you know how deeply broken it made some of us in the community wanting a tactical shooter that we didn't get until eventually Breaches came along. But to understand how this game was built up before launch, our expectations from its prequel, and ultimately our disappointment with the final product, we've got to take a look at the timeline from the very beginning to gain some sort of understanding of what went wrong with Firewall Ultra and how creating a game that is so anti-VRAF can be avoided in the future. To understand where the most recent Firewall tactical shooter unfortunately failed, we've got to take a look back in time to Firewall 0 Hour on the PSVR1. Before we deep dive into that though, two things. Only 20% of you are subscribed and we're trying to get to 10k. I'm fairly sure we wouldn't have by the time this comes out, but if we have, thank you. If we haven't, do feel free to sub. And two, we actually have a sponsor for today's video, and as you know, I grapple with sponsors quite a lot, trying to decide what to promote, and I've decided on most of my sponsorships, when they do happen, coming from VR companies, and that's exactly what is going on today. Today's video is sponsored by VRRock. These guys create precisely customized lenses based on your prescription. They do all headsets, but for me, I use them on my PSVR2, with blue light blocking options to provide vision protection, and anti-glare options as well. The VRRock lenses are perfect not only for people who need glasses for PSVR2, eliminating the middleman and meaning you can wear your headset without any fear of scratches, and also for people like me who don't need glasses but just want that extra layer of protection on your headset. The lenses are easy to install and remove, making them really convenient, and I absolutely love mine. So if you want to take a look at VRRock, their link will be down in the description below. And once again, thank you to VRRock for being the paid partner of today's video. So, going back in time to the 28th of August 2018, about 2 years after PSVR1's launch, Sony reveal Firewall 0 Hour. Made by First Contact Entertainment, this promised to be the equivalent of VR Rainbow Six Siege for us PSVR users, and for the most part, it lived up to that to the extent that it could with the restrictions of the PSVR1. It was playable with both the DualShock 4 and the PSVR aim controller, a peripheral in the shape of a gun, and to be honest, it worked pretty damn well. Even with the light tracking issues, it had a round-based system, decent gunplay, well-designed maps, and good-looking visuals for the headset. However, Firewall 0 Hour had a couple of issues that we promised would be flattened out for its sequel. For example, the rounds were simply too short, there weren't enough of them in a game, and when a game did end, it would send you back to matchmaking, meaning there were no persistent lobbies. The load times were very, very long. There was no option to start a game with lower than max player count. There were some issues with starting up private custom games, and the progression took a very, very long time. Despite this though, I really enjoyed 0 Hour and it became a cult classic in the PSVR community. To be honest, there are still people that play this game to this day, more so than Firewall Ultra, as we'll come on to see. But overall, it was a good first foray into the tactical shooter market for First Contact, and despite its problems, was loved by the community. Now flash forward to the launch of PSVR2 and we're getting some teasers for the next Firewall entry. At this point we had no idea this would probably be the last one due to its reception, but we were incredibly excited as a player base to get a tactical shooter built in Unreal Engine 5 that looked this good. The first few gameplay snippets showed off some incredible visuals, but also a worrying frame rate. But on the 24th of August 2023, the game finally rolled around. Over its marketing run, it promised to fix all of the previous game's mistakes, adding persistent lobbies, longer rounds, more rounds per match, and support for the Sense controllers, meaning that you'll have free movement with your right and left hand. However, during this period, a couple more red flags popped up, namely the lack of VRAF interactions where the player would just press a button and something would happen instead of interacting with the world in a typical VR manner. The first impressions from creators and journalists weren't too positive either. While they didn't have lots of bad things to say, overall their takeaway was that this was a very middle of the road, not very immersive but very good looking shooter, but only time would tell how the public would react to it when it was released on the 24th. Now I've got a bit of perspective on Firewall since it's been many months, and the game has unfortunately been essentially abandoned as Firewall's studio First Contact shut down. But upon its launch there were a myriad of issues. Some server-related issues where you couldn't even get into the game for a couple of days, but mostly with issues that still pertain to the game to this day, and throughout my testing over the last week or so, jumping back into the game, all of this is still prevalent. However, that doesn't mean everything's bad with Firewall. In some ways, it does deliver the promise of a tactical 5v5 and PvE shooter for PSVR2 that looks damn great. Because for one, the visuals here are stunning when they work. Simulated fog and mist absolutely pops in all the locations, the lighting is breathtaking, the placement of assets and the assets themselves are incredibly detailed, and even the character models are great too, having incredible rigging, very high fidelity, and being some of the best you can find on the headset. There's a similar story for the guns as well. The gun modeling is pretty great, but some do feel a little bit on the smaller side. However, that is just a nitpick. What isn't a nitpick though is that while there are no frame rate issues like the original trailers had, there is quite bad pop-in when turning corners. Not that you'll see assets spring into life, but you'll actually see the textures on assets appear out of nowhere, transitioning from a blinding white to the actual texture that they should be. This hasn't been fixed since launch and won't be due to the game not getting any more support, and it does break immersion sometimes when you round a corner and everything loads in. On the lower end of the visual issues, the game is reprojected, which honestly isn't too bad, but this is a tactical and meant to be competitive shooter. So reprojection cutting the frame rate down from a native 90 or 120 to a reprojected 60 is never good for latency or reaction times in the moment. The sound design for Firewall is as solid as it's always been. The gunshots are a bit muffled, but every sound is readable, most importantly, footsteps. This is carried over from the first game and actually makes the competitive matches a bit more viable, meaning that you will be able to hear your enemies and rely on audio cues just like in flat screen counterparts like Rainbow Six. So I don't really have too many complaints there, as I didn't at launch. But now we get to the biggest segment of them all, gameplay. In short, the game spends too much time in the menus and not enough in the game itself. Firewall at launch was known as a main menu simulator, and throughout its lifespan it continued to carry that name for various reasons. Through the launch window it was known as this because you could not get into a single match because the game was broken. Past launch it was known as this due to the countdown for the game timer being way too long. And now it's known as main menu simulator because the population isn't quite there to get a match off peak times in the day. If you do get into a game though, you'll find that yes, there are more rounds per game this time, and also there are persistent lobbies, meaning you'll be playing the same players if you wish, and won't have to matchmake for another game after your one finishes. Somehow the games and rounds still feel a little too short, nowhere near as bad as the original game, but still not great. The map design is a little confusing as well and busy in certain areas, but I think it does add to the visual style. But for sure at launch some people may have been put off by the fact that a lot of these maps are mazes, and the ones that have been carried over from the original game, because there are quite a few remasters of the original maps here, means that older players have a massive advantage over new ones. And if you're jumping into the game today, if you can even find a match, you'll be playing against players who have been sinking a lot of hours and are dedicated to Firewall, meaning you're going to have a bit of a tough time. That's no fault of the game though, but it is something that will put off newer players if they wished for some reason to buy this game. The progression is a similar story to the original game as well, being incredibly slow and quite confusing in what unlocks went where. It didn't help that when the game launched, challenges weren't unlocked, meaning that you couldn't progress very fast, and your progression would reset every single time you logged into the game for the first couple of weeks. These bugs could be ironed out though and fixed, and most of them have been at this point, but I think it is just too little too late, especially with the closure of the studio. Firewall's never going to get the player count that it really stried to get. However, there are more fundamental issues at play here other than these bugs that really brought down the game experience for a lot of players, including myself. The biggest one being you click a button to do everything. There are no VR interactions in Firewall as you'd expect from a game like Saints and Sinners, Horizon, or even Resi 8 to an extent. Whether it's opening a door, changing weapon, even reloading is a click of the button. You don't take a magazine out, put another one in and cock your rifle, you push a button and your character does that all for you, while your hands move without your consent, meaning that when they end up somewhere after the reload, it's not where you'd expect them to be, and you as a player just have less agency. On the one hand, I do understand for a competitive shooter, it does make sense to have these timed reloads. It makes it so that each gun can be balanced a bit better, because in flat screen games, reload time is a way to balance the guns for the sandbox of the game that you're playing. However, this click to reload system just was not it. If we take a look at a more recent game like Breaches, the reloading there is done far better. You manually reload the gun, but you don't cock the weapon after you put a magazine in. Instead, the game takes a predetermined amount of time to play a little reload sound after you load the magazine, meaning each weapon can be balanced this way. Ultimately, Firewall's approach of making everything you do in the game a push of L1 or X or square just wasn't the right call in the end. There are a couple of great uses of the PSVR2 features here though, and upon revisiting the game, it's awesome to see how the PSVR2 eye tracking is used for things like flashbangs. If you close your eyes when a flashbang goes off, the effects of it will be nullified. And in theory, the use of eye tracking to select menus and the weapon wheel is a great idea. However, this is the only PSVR2 game where I found that the eye tracking is slightly off, and the more I played, the more off-center it became. This was highlighted in early reviews and previews from creators and journalists, and unfortunately it still is prevalent to this day. Additionally, while the use of eye tracking as well to throw grenades is a very neat feature, it would just be better for the player's own agency and feeling immersed to send grenades at enemies with a traditional throw of the hand. Ultimately, in retrospect, Firewall Ultra did not hit the mark at all for a tactical shooter due to these baseline issues. There are moments of greatness here and different mechanics that I hope get pulled into other games in the future in the same genre, but it's easy to see why people didn't latch onto this at launch and why the player base dropped off quickly. Unfortunately, we'll never see Firewall Ultra get to the peak of its life cycle like we did with 0 Hour because the dev team unfortunately no longer exist. It was really tough to see them get laid off, and while I don't think the game was a great one, no one deserves to have their job axed like that. However, I hope today's video has given you a bit of an insight into the launch of Firewall 0 Hour and Firewall Ultra on PSVR and PSVR2 and get across my views on it all these months later. Thank you all for watching. Thank you to our patrons and YouTube members Luke Bentley, Phil Irving, Hazik Mirza, Ace Gamer, Hippie Pickle, Jin007, A License to Chill, Sun WTF, Piosco, and Fat Controllers. If you want to join the Patreon or YouTube membership, all of those are in the link in the description along with the Discord. Thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one.